All right, guys, welcome to this month's video. This is going to be a one-shot here in Paestum. Paestum is a very old Greek colony. We have this beautiful Doric temple that is 2,500 years old. I'm going to try to paint a little interior of it. And this is going to be very fun because we're going to be talking about stone and a little bit of foliage and also light. And it's going to be a very complex subject to draw. I was painting today and I have a bunch of color already on my palette and in my brushes, but let me clean things up. For those of you that have been watching for a while, maybe this is your first video, my palette today as follows is white, and this today is actually lead white. It's not always lead white, sometimes it's titanium. The cadmium, yellow lemon, yellow medium, orange, and red. This is quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, viridian, ivory black, burnt sienna, yellow ochre. Very little of my chromatic colors to be used today. A lot of earth colors. Earth colors and stone are super useful, super helpful, super easy. The thing that I was really drawn to, the subject of this painting, some of the depth, some of the light, and also the bits of little green foliage here in the distance, and particularly that raking light on these. The sun's coming in and out, so I might have some sunlight, I might not have some sunlight. My first consideration is my subject matter. So do I want to include the columns on the left or the opening and some more of those greens on the right? Well, if I use my hands as a viewfinder, I find that I think I want to include some sky here, most of the big chunk of sky between the second and third columns that I'm facing. Center that, have these two big columns here in the front in the foreground, and fit everything else off to the side. Architecture, very static subject. We don't really move things around like we might if we have some trees or some bushes. If I start moving these columns around, it's gonna completely fall apart and not make sense at all. The tone of my canvas is a nice middle gray tone that is very useful to use. So I'm not gonna reach for the paint that I have on my palette right now. Rather, I'm gonna reach for some new paint. So a little bit of my white, a little bit of yellow, a little bit yellow ochre, a little bit of burnt sienna, and a little bit of ultramarine blue. For the most part, I want to keep the relative tone of the painting showing through in many places. This isn't necessarily a horizon line, but I want to include what we call the stylobate and the stereobate of the temple, which is the base of the temple, and we see that they're made up of separate rocks. So I want to include that on the bottom. And then somewhere here up top, I want to include the soffit of the architrave, which is the underside, and then the architrave are the blocks that rest atop the columns and help set up the roof. I'm going to just start sketching in with a bit of paint and try to capture my proportions. Some of the big tools that I like using for going in for architecture is comparative measurement and shapes and seeing how the two connect to each other. So in this case, I have the shapes of the sky. The negative shapes of the sky are going to be key for finding this, but I also want to find some big heights and widths. So let me measure from the top of the stylobate, the base of the temple, and let me do that to the soffit or the bottom of the architrave that is in the depth in the second stage. Measure that up, and I see that it's actually less than halfway. So it's actually, if this would be a point and this would be a point, and then we'd have a little bit of space. So I do that by measuring my entire sky shape below the tree up to the top of the negative shape of the sky, and then take that measurement, bring it up, and yeah, maybe this has to come down just a little bit. So I'm gonna start blocking that in, and I'll give in a little bit of height. Let me see the height of the second layer of the entablature. Actually, this height is a little bit more than halfway between this shape. So let me take that measurement, bring it up, say, okay, well, it comes out to about here. Now let me find some widths. Let me find the width of the opening in between the columns. And I say, okay, the width between the opening of the columns is more than this point. Let me see the columns themselves. The widths of the columns themselves are actually equal to this. So equal to this distance, which seems to be fitting in mostly well. Avoiding anything in the halfway point. I want to offset this. I don't want to have anything nice and halfway. What I want to do is bring in the left turn corner column on the left. And so have, looking at now the negative shape, have this slightly off-centered to the right, and then have the big triangular shape under it off-centered to the left. Mostly focusing on the negative shapes, the proportion of, say, this shape, paying attention to its character. And now looking for some horizontal alignments. And I'm also going to check the angle of the pediment that we see. So the raking pediment, the slanted angled pediment. I'm going to drop that angle in. And now I'm going to look at this negative shape. I see there are some things that need to be coming in. But starting to build off our painting. And most of our painting is going to be built off of this shape. Let me check myself. So let's see where the other bit of sky comes out to. Well, it's a bit more than this shape. Comes out to about here. Let's see the horizontal alignments, because there's the abacus, which is the pizza box shaped, this very flat square. That comes out a bit to the left. And this has to come out a bit to the right. All right, let's find the big shape over here to the sky. That's looking okay. Then cut in this shape, looking for this rectangle in between this. Where exactly does it cut out to? There is, I don't know what it's called, but the inside wall. So these columns I see on the exterior, they're part of the facade of the portico. And then there are interior features to the wall. And then we see a little bit, not that much, but a little bit of sky. And look for my horizontal alignments to where the sky ends, because we actually see the top of the back of the temple over onto the left. So now follow the abacus, follow the echinus, which is the bowl shape underneath. This is a Doric temple. Pay attention to the width of this column. Now at this point, I'm actually a little unhappy with how this light shape over here on my left will turn out. The reason I'm a little unhappy is because I don't want it being so cut off into the edge. So I think what I need to do, originally I based my heights off of how I wanted to fit things vertically, but I didn't base it off of how I want to fit things horizontally. So let me shrink things just a bit, taking mostly white. Let me shrink some things down. Let me check my widths compared to my height. So the width from this point to this point, what is that compared to a big height? Well, so that should actually come out to roughly there. So there's a square here, so yeah. So this, does this come out? Yes, so I do need to lower all of this. So let me keep the bottom where it is. Let me keep this anchor where it is. And now I'm going to find the measurement that I want it to be. So let's say I want it to be yay big. That means I want it to be here. And now this width needs to be a square. So I'll bring down some of these heights. To recap, what I did is found the proportion that I want to have by judging off of my widths to my heights. I figured out almost arbitrarily where I wanted to see the sky coming in on this painting on both of these sides, and then I measured that against the height, and I found that it was at here. That was the scale of my painting, the height to the width that I had initially blocked in for, but I wanted this measurement, which would come down to down here. So I plopped in this white shape, and the negative shape from this point to these sides in between these openings was sort of a square. So that informs me that I could bring some things down. And so I brought that down a little bit more than 1/2 inch. That means I bring this down a bit more than 1/4 because it's halfway. And now let me continue to block in some more of these columns. So this, I want to keep the columns of light, roughly. And so now let me put more white in for my sky. And I'll reach for a little bit of ultramarine blue to go for with this white. Now let me find the shape of the sky at the bottom of the horizon. Using a tone surface can be really helpful, especially when the tone relates to the subject that we're painting. So in this example, the tone really relates well to the stone of these columns, and that automatically just makes my life so much easier. All right, looking for that big angle up there. Looking for horizontal alignments. Now, let me mix up a whole bunch of color for the stone in the shadows, mostly burnt sienna, yellow ochre, and some ultramarine. And let's start massing some things in. So there's a little bit of light on these columns, which I'm pretty happy about, because this raking light is going to be a ton of fun to paint. Let's find the angle, just drop that angle in of the inside columns. The inside of these columns are really nice and dark. As well as the top of this column has some nice shadow to it. And then we could also look for the bottoms of the capitals over here to the left, to the right. Keep messing up left and right today. Sorry, guys. So at a certain point, we can really start focusing in and honing in on our positive and negative shapes to see how they are relating to everything else in the scene. And I'm also going to start thinking about color temperatures and about different aspects of the architecture. So I see over here, there are these little rings at the neck of the etchiness at the bottom. at the very top of the shaft of the column. So to my best knowledge, those are called annulets. There are a few other names that they sometimes are given. I'm looking at this shape up here. So I'm paying attention to the shape of my sky, and I want to cut that in. Give myself a little bit more structure right in here. Let's reach for a little bit of blue and burnt sienna, and paying attention to the small, tiny shapes. So these small shapes right below the etchiness, I need to count out and make sure that there's enough space for the entire painting. Now let me continue by massing in a little bit more of light and shadow. So especially here, let me just take some Viridian and ultramarine blue to capture some of these darker plants. And I see 3 columns here, 1, 2, 3, and the third column has horizontally aligned with about 2/3 up the entablature of the back. So the entablature is the bit that rests above the columns. And then there's a lot of darks over here, which I'm going to try to include. There's some purples, so grab for some ultramarine blue and magenta. That was already on my palette. I'm seeing in these columns back here, maybe it's because of atmospheric perspective or maybe it's something else, there are a little bit of hints of purple back here. The stylobate has a lot of cool hints to it. So let me mix some more white into that purple with some ivory black ultramarine blue. And now let me start adding some color variety into this painting. And I'm going to carefully find the space for the little bits of light shape over here. You see through these columns, there's a little bit of light that's being filtered out. It's the painting. Make sure to cover it all. Then I can reach back for some burnt sienna. Here, there's actually something that is in between columns. So this is in the middle, this entrance to the chamber. And let me take this orange, which is mostly burnt sienna, because I think this orange, well, it needs to get darker, more neutralized, so I'm going to reach for a little bit more ultramarine blue. And then spread that around. Find some more intense yellows in the bottoms of the etchiness. And also you could really start seeing some of the color. As we start to progress our painting, that is when we're able to see more and more variety. So whenever we first start a new painting, we are actually pretty limited with what stuff we're able to see. And it's through painting itself that we're able to more deeply observe the world, which is pretty fun. Right, accidentally painting over the lights. So just scrubbing them out with my brush, just wiping the paint away with the edge of my brush. All right, so very soon I'm going to start drawing and painting a lot smaller and smaller refinements. One of the things I want to do right now, I see a lot of contrast between the white sky and my lights, especially here on this pediment. So I want to capture what I see and create enough light in here so where these are darkened just a little bit, gosh, not too much, but just a little bit darker. And then those are even still just a tiny bit darker. Mixing up, I'll use a little bit of cobalt or viridian this time, in addition to the burnt sienna, yellow ochre, bunch of white. And now let's offset just a nice value right in there. So squinting down, I say, okay, yeah, that's pretty close. But now if I flick my eyes back and forth a whole bunch, I see that it's a bit too orange and it needs to gray down. So a lot of the stone here is nice and gray. Cut in that shadow to capture the sharpness of the column. Capture the sharpness of this area. Now, we'll add a bit more blue to this column. I'll start scrubbing in some of the textures that we see specifically in this column. Remember that as I'm squinting down, I'm observing a lot of the color in my squinting impression, meaning I squint to see how the lights and the shadows are separated. So if I'm not separating my lights and my shadows, I'm going to lose the light effect. But separating our lights and shadows into distinct values is key. So not mixing up our lights and not mixing up our shadows. It's especially important in a scene like this where we have a lot of lights and we have a lot of shadows and we think that there could be a lot of overlap. So it's just all the more important to be very conscious of that. All right, and now some of that light is gone. I'm gonna take a small brush, a small sable, and with some more ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, I'm gonna go back in and re-outline and draw in some features. So I'm gonna actually go in and pay attention to all the darker shapes that I see under every stone. So underneath all of these stones, there's a lot of character. And there are some darker accents. So if I find those, that'll be pretty good. Up here, there's some darks, and there's some dark moss type of thing. And I'm paying attention to this shape. It's sort of triangular, paying attention that there's a perspective that comes in that matches the perspective of these buildings. So at this point, just drawing shapes, but at a certain point, pay attention to perspective. And now, going into this column, I'm going to pay attention to the dark accents along it. So there are some dark accents on the soffit of this architrave. There's a fair number of accents and just darker notes here. And also the entire capital is pretty dark, as well as this one over here to the left. But then over here we have a nice big sharp shape, and we see just how wide, or in this case just how tall, some of these shapes are. So that height of this is very important. there are a lot of cracks and little bits. So the rock that they used is really sedimentary. It's very porous, and over time it's just started to fall apart. And that gives it a really interesting texture. I see these at the drum line. There are some cracks, and so I look at the horizontal alignment from the height of that drum line. I see it passes halfway more up from this sky shape. And I see that the darkest bit in this area is over here underneath the soffit. Here, there's some shadows in the ceiling and also on these blocks along the pediment. So I have 3 abaci right in here. And I'll pay attention to these columns. These columns are going to be lightest in value, and these columns inside, there's a lot less light that's filtering into them. So they're going to be a little bit darker. Also here, pay attention to the perspective, pay attention to the top of the etchiness underneath the abacus. There's a bit of light that comes there. And then I think if I look at this alignment of these lines, first I saw it by, I just saw a drawing mistake. There needs to be more space. First, I was looking at the amount of space from the top of this abacus to the bottom of the soffit. So there's that. But then I noticed that this shape, there's an alignment that was lacking. And I can still keep pushing down on the actual abacus itself. I accidentally got some orange onto this brush, and the thing is I don't need any orange anywhere. So the opposite of orange is blue. To neutralize that, and then add some yellow. And now we have a chromatic gray. Just by neutralizing that orange, adding a bit of yellow, now we have a gray in this pile right here on my palette that is useful. Bringing in those lights, adding a bit more white to that mixture. I'll start cutting in some of the light on my columns, as well as the stylobate. Let's reach for a bunch of lead white and pull over. Pay attention to the actual width of these shapes. Pay attention that I'm starting to lose a bit of information. Let me cover this entirely. It doesn't need to be the perfect color, but it needs to have a little bit more refinement in there. Cover this light. So see from the column, comes out a big accent. Then I see there's some more light on the inside of the temple. When I squint down, I do see I'm getting a little bit of light on the side of this column. as well as some indescript shapes over here. Paying attention to just the shapes of the values first. Over here, this column has got some more oranges and reds and yellows in the lights, where it gets a bit dark. Now let me go back into the columns and draw out some more. I see there's a big cutout. It's horizontally aligned to the top of this. So there's a really big cutout in this column. Fine, I see a point here. I look for the horizontal alignment. I see that it's almost at the same point here, a little bit lower. And then I also look for the triangulation between these points. I see triangulating from the left and right of the bottom of the shaft of the column. It comes out to about yay tall of a triangle. And then I start seeing some of this column, some of the fluting, but I really see the blues within this light compared to the yellows. Ask yourself, what are the colors you see and what are those relationships? And paint the relationships is painting the relationships is one of the things we can do rather than trying to find the big average, which can often leave our color a little flat. But if we look for the relationships of color and we push those relationships, because we know our painting is limited in the range of color compared to the natural world, well, that's going to be a pretty neat little thing by the time we finish painting. And the one thing I need to maintain, we can push the color and we can push the value, but we always need to maintain relationships. And that's what keying a painting or keying your color key or your value key is all about. Finding the optimal set of relationships for the effect you're going after in your painting. So here I see some big arcs of blue, and they're almost like rings that they follow this column. I think some of these are actually getting a little bit too dark. So I'm gonna go back in. There's some patternings up here at the very top of the base, the top of the column, I mean. It's very fascinating. Now, I see the contrast between the sky and the columns. Let me re-emphasize that, because even within these columns, there's a transition as it gets lighter to darker. And right now, yes, some of the sun left again. The sun keeps coming in and out. But paying attention. So what's happening there? There's a back column. So I'm going to include that and help offset the value of this front column. Let me work to cover the canvas a little bit further. And then let me draw out the tops of the abaci and draw out the big blocks of the architrave, the epistyle. So there's this big block, there's a valley that separates it. We sort of see the bottom of the Teneo, which is the line that runs across, but we don't see it too much. Let me just cover in and scrub the canvas, move my paper clips up. I'll have a YouTube video talking about all these paintings. So all these paintings that I'm doing right now in Europe will be for sale, in case any of you guys want them. Those oranges are a bit crazy. Let me go back and find some of the blues. That's a little too dark, so take some white, lighten it. Oh, and now that's a little bit too light. So I'll just mix in between the two. The general progression on a painting like this is first we have to block in the color and first block in the drawing, most important step. Then we block in a bit of the color. But eventually we want to start thinking about the material of what it is that we're actually drawing. And so how do I, using paint and the application of paint with brushstroke, how do I start to get it to a point where it starts to feel like the material that I'm looking at? That is the biggest challenge. So part of it comes in shapes of colors. If you get the shapes of colors right, that does a lot. But part of it is feeling the texture and trying to recreate the feeling of the texture, the way that we can feel the anatomy or feel perspective, feel turning of light. Comes to a point where feeling becomes much more important. Light is coming and going. Oftentimes in plein air situations, what we can do with the lights is compress them and blow them out, and we really find color in the shadows, so variety in the shadows. As I look up and down this entire column, I see that the lightest parts of the column are at the base, and as they rise up, things get a little bit darker. So here the bottom of the Echinai needs to get darker, including the bottom of the abacus. So when I find that big color first, then I can go in and outline it, outline the very subtle, maybe either the edge, but also the ellipse of the top of it. So crevices are always a little bit darker. You need to pay attention that this ellipse is symmetrical. That's one of the issues I was running into a little bit earlier. I've really used a lot of paint on this painting, more so than most of the time, because I think I started this painting using only lead. One of the reasons to use titanium white is because it is actually a lot thinner and it doesn't cake on the same way that lead does if you start painting with only lead. But you know, it's a give and take. There are nice things about it and there are not so nice things about it. Let me go in and outline some of the line work, adjust the contours of these blocks on the top. Going in and finding the design and finding the outline of these blocks is one way to show, especially with a blue color, is one way to show that the sky is so much lighter than these blocks, because there's a little bit of color variety that happens there. And also I could start drawing in the blocks and paying attention to what's actually there. So these little darker accents do a lot for the light effect. And let's look for other areas. I need to separate this element from this column somehow, and also capture some of the bands of color that are sort of disintegrating in this rock to really capture the variety. And then I'll go back in and repaint some stuff later, or a whole bunch of pieces that are missing. And I'll try to include hints of the fluting on the left column. There are a lot of ways to approach and start refining a painting. One of my favorite ways is, I was about to call it the haphazard way, but other people have described it as herding sheep. And it simply means that you start with the thing that is lagging furthest behind and keep bringing that up. And you're working around the entire painting as opposed to pick one thing, refine it, finish it, move on to the next, which is not a terrible way to do things. It's just not how I most commonly do things. These bands. Oh, it looks like I might have a little drawing error. Yep, so that needs to come down. Looking at the horizontal alignment between the top of this sky and this element. And because I was noticing that, once again, we were missing enough space in here for all the features of this column. And I'm noticing I'm missing a few darker marks within this column. That's some of the texture in the architrave. Okay, two things. Mix up some green for the green foliage that is in the shadow of the temple, and start finding moments where where it is. So we could use a little bit of ivory black, a little bit of cad yellow to find some of that. So he's really, and in here there are a bunch of them. This is an example of making things come to life. There's a little tiny bit of green over here on the left of this column. So one of the problems that we can often find ourselves having is not having enough elements in our painting, not paying attention to all the small things that are actually in the painting that make the painting come to life. If we're painting a wall, to include the outlets, the base molding, and the light switches instead of just a flat wall in a room. We need to have these small things, these tiny details to carry us through the entire painting. And there are also a lot of greens that are here underneath the stylobate. Oh, hi Andre. Say hi to the Patreon students. If you guys don't follow Andre Kateriniak, you guys should. Good friend, good painter. Lives in Florence with his wife Angelina, who's another amazing painter. All right, now those greens are there. Oh, there's a little bit of green that's sticking out at the top of this column. And there's some more greens that are just some little bushes that are sticking out up against the sky. That'll make a big difference to start to include those. All right, let me go back in and try to remember where this raking light was. So it's on the sides of these columns, and it's really disappeared from the painting, but I could include what I thought I remembered. And a few of these lights will help make a difference. And I'm putting them in a way to represent the fluting on the actual columns. And down here, I do remember this was quite contrasting. And also there's a little bit of light on this stone and then on the insides of these columns. One of my worries right now is about the values on my painting. So I want to scrape down just a little bit of the texture. And it's not often that I may scrape down mid-session, mid-painting. For this painting, I just added a little bit more titanium white on my palette. And now I want to go back in and restate some clouds. And all of a sudden that opens up a whole world of paint and of a sense of light in my painting. Clear that up. And I think that's gonna allow me to paint some of my columns a little bit lighter. In a second. Also want a little bit more light down here. Up until these trees. And in here, I'll use the white, cut out some of these big boulders. I'm not going to cut in using big brush marks to add a little bit of character to the contrast, the contours of the rocks. That little bit of character, that little bit of specificity is something we're always after. And now do I also want to use that for some of these lights? Well, let me just take a little bit of cad orange. Shoot, way too much. A little bit of my yellow ochre. Specifically in these parts, right in here. I remember some things were a bit too dark. I could also mess with the texture of these bricks up here. All right, stop using that brush because I should leave it for the sky. And go back, but using my sable and re-outline some of these lights. Re-outline the edges of this column, just a bit of the drawing. If I flick my eyes back and forth from my painting to the subject to my painting again, once again, I see things as being a little bit too dark. Or lighter here, but there's still shadow effect. So now I'm slowly looking at the relationships of all of these values. Use a little bit of black and ivory and burnt sienna to really push a few select darks. So I see the bottom of an abacus. Make sure to include that. Actually, two bottoms of abaci. Seeing some texture up in here. And another dark accent at the top of the sky. Separating these elements from one another. Now here I could put a bit more darker blue to help create the atmosphere. Recession of atmospheric perspective. And then let me go back in and restructure some of the structure of this rock. Do that with a much bigger brush. Let's try this big filbert and let's just pounce and add some more organic marks. So varying my brush marks. And this helps, create variety, create interest, create texture. Does that column feel like I have captured it and put it on the page yet? I think I need to lighten and cool some things. So reaching for a bunch of the white on my palette, along with a bunch of ultramarine blue. All right, the sun's coming out again. That's nice and pretty. So I'm gonna pay attention to the cooler marks of the texture. Feel the warms and the cools a bit. And bring that over. Remember, one of the things that we can do instead of adjusting with value all the time is adjusting with chroma. Pushing up some of the colors towards the top of the capital. There's a lot of color variety in here. Trying to not make up these marks, but painting the exact shapes that we see there. And then there are a lot of those lighter marks on the side of this abacus here at the top. So it's not all dark up there, but it just has to be light enough. And again, a bit of pouncing. Not all the same, but trying to get some variety. compared to what we have. Capture the side of the light here. Capture a couple of the lights on edges over there. There's a tree that I've just basically been kind of ignoring, but it's back there, so I think we should probably paint it. It's going to be a bit annoying painting into the white. So keep going back, loading in. And carefully cutting out the temple with that tree color. So we squint down. The shadow of the tree is darker than the big mass of this stone here. Outlining that works pretty well. Let's go for the lights of the tree. So taking a bit of white, bit of green. Make sure the tree is soft against the sky. Take my sky brush and using its clean parts, brush it in a little bit. Now take a bunch of ivory black, burnt sienna, and go back in and re-outline some of the darks within this stone, re-outline some of the texture that was lost. Especially over here on the right, there's a big thingamajig. Let's call it that. There's a big thingamajig. And also add some of the details on this rock and some of the crumbling. So most of the fluting on this side is actually gone, just wear and tear over the years. And so now I really just want to keep working and adjusting some of the texture. Also, once again, I'm going to go in with some really small lines. Pay attention to little details. Little annulets on these columns. Little bits of green. And the layers of these rocks. I see some darker bits of the column. And over here underneath the necking, there's a darker shade of the stone. So finding the variety within the stones is not easy, but it's so worth it when we finally capture it. And it really brings the painting to life. So that little line of blue right here did a whole lot to accent the shadow of this rock. So I think I'll take a bit more blue with maybe even a little bit of alizarin. Re-outline some of this annulate. All right, one of the things, let me check the perspective. Need to lower it down here a tad. Maybe raise it a little bit up at the very, very edge. When I took a photo, I thought I was close to being done. I took a photo for Instagram. And sometimes when we take photos, we realize the things we need to fix. There's a bit of a concave molding right here at the top. So finding some of those bits where there's contrast between these two columns and losing the edges where they're actually lost, but finding them where we can actually find them and see them. Very important. All right, let me use this brush, mix a bit more green using cad yellow and ivory black. And find some of the darker hints of ivory black. So this ivory black right now, whoops, way too dark over there. Putting that ivory black in some select spots now really helps with my level of values and my range. So it offsets these, and now having like just that little dark mark down there, that creates more range for these shadows, and these darks ultimately offset the columns that are here that have a ton of light filtering out into them. And you know, maybe I need to add just a few more lighter blue bits. And what about pushing just a few hints of blue even further? So I see that there's this one ring over here. Let's push just a couple of them. And mixing into the wet paint. I want to start wrapping this up. So I'm paying attention to what is missing. The underside of the capital down here is a little light. Stepping back, it appeared that way to me. So there are these little bits of lighter values right above, and I think that's right on the neck. And also on the very edge. It's a little bit lighter before it gets darkened. So these values really have a lot to do with the form. So at the top of the edginess, right underneath the abacus, it's somewhat side facing. And then it comes down and faces the ground before it goes back to being side facing. So there's a little bit where it's lighter, darker, lighter. then there are, of course, bands within these stones that have a lot of variety. One of the ways to look for color right now, to look for those subtle things of color, is to really be observant. It really helps the fact that I have just a little bit of light on my canvas right now, and it helps me read on a one-to-one way with the scene. And if I just flick my eyes back and forth and move things around, I'm able to see a whole lot of what still needs to happen. There's a really dark accent on the left of this column for some reason. I think it's a little bit lighter. Down here under the isthmus. These little bits count out the very specific little nicks in the column. Some of those. Take a step back, assess the day's work, say, yeah. I think that's okay for now. All right, it's been a fun painting, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I have some other Pastem content that might be on the way. I really need to just sit down and look through all the footage, but I have a good feeling about this painting, and I think this will get to you guys. And yeah, you know, if you guys want to collect one of my paintings, buy one, original. There will be a summer sale very shortly. So yeah, there's that. And last thing, cut out this side, side, side. These lights, this light. All right, guys. Catch you next time.